Good morning, everyone. Today's DAF contains a number of abstract ideas, so much so to the point where Rashi, I think, is troubled a little bit by some of the explanations in the Gemara, so he offers different alternative positions. But anyway, we'll try to simplify it as much as possible. We're about the 10th line of the Gemara. The Gemara had brought us a machlokas yesterday between Rav and Shmuel, as whether yesh chuppah la pesulos or ein chuppah la pesulos. Now, what this means is does the act of placing a woman under a chuppah, does it constitute an act of marriage to the point where if the relationship between the man and the woman is a forbidden relationship, she is now prohibited from truma, either going back to her father's house to eat truma and usher to eat her new husband's truma as well? Or do we say that no, since she hasn't been rendered a halala physically through intimacy, then it doesn't render her puzzle for the kahuna? So this is the question. Rav says it does render her puzzle, and Shmuel says it does not. The Gemara had attempted to say that this is the same achlokas between Reb Meir on the one hand in our Mishnah and Reb Shimon and Reb Elazar on the other hand in our Mishnah, because they were talking about a similar case of where you present a woman with kesef kiddushin in a forbidden relationship. Does the presentation of kesef kiddushin create a situation where now she's puzzle for the kahuna, because the purpose of kiddushin is ultimately for consummation purposes, and therefore we look at it almost as if she's headed towards that direction, and thus she becomes puzzle right now. So Reb Meir says puzzle, and Reb Shimon and Reb Elazar say no, that since Lamaisa she hasn't been physically affected, so therefore she's not puzzle yet. But the Gemara had rejected that. The Gemara had said no, that the case of chuppah is fundamentally different in two ways. Number one, it's not a marriage, because there's no kiddushin. And number two, on the other hand, it is one step closer to consummation, because the function of chuppah is for the purpose of bringing her into your home. So therefore, the Gemara said it's really not analogous, so ultimately we're going to have to find another issue. So the Ela Ikala Meimar Beplugta Dahani Tanoi. So if we really want to line up Rav and Shmuel's machlokas about chuppah, it really is in alignment with the following brisa. Detanya. Nisu zu v'zu kesherosu pesulos. Now it's talking about a kohen who marries different kinds of women. He marries kosher women and he marries puzzle women. In other words, women who are kosher to marry a kohen and women who are puzzle to marry a kohen. O shenichnasu lechuppah v'lo nivalu. Or he brings these kinds of women into the chuppah without physically consummating. Ochlos mishalo va'ochlos betruma. Then in this situation, even though the woman has been brought to the chuppah, she's allowed to eat his truma and she's allowed to go home and eat her father's truma as well. In other words, she's still kosher for the kahuna. So the Gemara now says, we're going to sort of interrupt the brisa midstream just to clarify what this first line of the brisa means. Nichnasu, what's the first line? It says that either nisu or nichnasu lachuppah. So michlal denisu, nisu mamish. So it sounds like the first line, when it says she gets married, it means that she's fully married to the kohen. Now, if she's fully married to the kohen, how can the brisa then say that she's not puzzled to the kahuna? She can still eat truma. That's an inherent contradiction, because any woman who's become a chalola through having intimacy with a man that's puzzled to her is now puzzled for the kahuna. We know that. That's an established halacha. How can the brisa say otherwise? Elalav kagon shenichnasu lachuppah v'lo nivalu. So rather, the Gemara says you have to modify your understanding of the brisa. The second line really explains the first line. Instead of saying nisu zu v'zu ksherosu psulos, that if a man gets married or shenichnasu lachuppah, or he brings the woman who's under the chuppah, the O is really I.e., meaning that is. What is the definition of nisu for this brisa? Not a real nisuin where they consummate the marriage, but rather bringing her under the chuppah. In that situation, since you only brought her under the chuppah and you haven't fully
been physically intimate with her. So v'lo nivalu katani ochlos mishalo v'ochlos b'truma. The first Tana says that she's still completely allowed to eat truma. She's not puzzled to the kahuna yet. So this seems to be aligned with Shmuel, who says that just bringing a woman under the chuppah does not passel her for truma. Rabbi Yishmael beno shel Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka Omer, Kol shebi'asa ma'achilasa chupa ma'achilasa, v'chol she'ein bi'asa ma'achilasa ein chupasa ma'achilasa. And here Rabbi Yishmael disagrees, and he says, no, if the act of bia will permit her to eat truma, so then the act of chuppah will permit her to eat truma. But if the act of bia will not permit her to eat truma because she's married to a person who's puzzled to her, so then her chuppah will also not permit her. So it seems like Rabbi Yishmael is the same thing as Rav. So here you have this machlokas, Rav and Shmuel, reiterated by the Brisa. So the Gemara says, not necessarily. Mimai. Dilma Rabbi Yishmael beno shel Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka kereb Meir sfir le d'amar kiddushin lo achla. So maybe the reason why Rabbi Yishmael says that this woman is tainted and is not allowed to partake in truma, she's puzzled for the kahuna, is not because of the chuppah that she had, but rather because it was preceded by kiddushin. And he holds like Rabbi Meir, who says that when you present full-blown kiddushin to a woman, even before consummating, since that kiddushin is destined for making her into a chalala, we view her as if she's a chalala right now, and that's the reason. It's not because of the chuppah, but rather because of the kiddushin. So the Gemara says, but how could you say that? Hi kol she'ein bi'asa ma'achilasa ein chupasa ma'achilasa. Then why did he say that if the bia does not permit her to eat, then the chuppah does not permit her to eat? He should have said, kol she'ein bi'asa ma'achilasa ein kaspa ma'achilasa miboyele. That's the point he should have raised. He should have said that the issue over here is the fact that she had kiddushin. But he doesn't say that. He says that the issue is that she's been stigmatized by the chuppah. So you can't say that. So Dilma Aidi da Amar Tanakama chuppah, Amar Ihu Nami chuppah. No, says the Gemara. Maybe I'll tell you like this. Really, that the Tanakama is telling you a chiddush. The Tanakama is telling you that even though this woman went to chuppah completely after having gotten kiddushin, in reality she's still not stigmatized because there's been no physical intimacy between her and the man she's puzzled to, and therefore she's still allowed to eat truma. And because the Tanakama was talking about chuppah, comes along Rabbi Yishmael and addresses chuppah as well. But in reality, the thing that he holds that stigmatizes her is not the chuppah, but rather is the kiddushin. So therefore, you have no raya from this brisa that the machlokas between Rav and Shmuel, which is about the chuppah itself, is rooted in a brisa. So Amar Rav Amram, Ha Milsa Amarlan Rav Sheshes Van Harinu La'ainim Nimasnisin Yesh Chuppah La Pesulos. That the following psak was issued by Rav Sheshes to us, and he illuminated our eyes to point to a Mishnah which supports this psak. And what is the psak? Like Rav holds, Yesh Chuppah La Pesulos. That just bringing a woman under the chuppah renders her puzzle for truma, renders her puzzle to the kahuna. The Tanatuna, and now let's look at the Mishnah that he brings to as a support to that. So first of all, this Mishnah is in Maseches Sota, and it's talking about why does the Torah, when it talks about making the Sota take a vow, the Kohen recites certain words to her, and he says that if you've been unfaithful, the water will curse you, and the woman has to answer Amen. And yet, the Torah says the word Amen twice. It says, V'amaraha Isha, Amen, Amen. She says Amen. Now, why does the word Amen mention twice in the Pasuk? So the Mishnah explains, Shalos Atisi, Arusa, Unesua, Shomeres Yavam, Uchenusa. It's to teach me that she has to acknowledge that she has not strayed from her husband either as an Arusa, or a Nesua, or a Shomeres Yavam, or a woman who's already had Yibum. So, in other words, the Mishnah is pointing out that the protocol of the Sota is in effect in all of these cases. So, Hai Arusa Heichi Dami. What's the case of a woman who's an Arusa? What are you telling me? That the protocol of Sota applies to her? Ilei Metakanila Kishihi Arusa, and the Istatura, the Kamashkala Kishihi Arusa,
Arusa bas mishtayahi. So the Gemara's question is, you can't tell me that what the Mishnah means is that a man betroths a woman, he has erusin with a woman, and then he does the act called kinoi, which is a necessary step in the sota process. He's got to tell her, I hereby am expressing my jealousy between that you may be having a relationship of some kind with that other man, with Ploni. I therefore admonish you not to be seen with Ploni. She then goes ahead and secludes herself with Ploni in front of witnesses, and then on that basis, when you have kinoi and stira, you can bring a woman to the Kohen and bring her the water to drink. So the Gemara is saying, what do you mean that the Mishnah says that this applies to an arusa? If you're telling me that only after erusin he does kinoi, he presents her, he tells her not to be seen with Ploni, and then as an arusa she secludes herself with Ploni, and then as an arusa he brings her to the Kohen, he says that doesn't work. There's no such protocol for an arusa, because v'hatanan arusa v'shomeres yavam lo shosos v'lo los ksuva. There's a very clear halacha that the only time you do the protocol of the sota is if they're actually husband and wife. But if she's just an arusa or a shomeres yavam waiting to consummate the marriage, then you don't bring a woman to the Kohen, but instead you just divorce her, and she's dismissed without taking her ksuva, because she's shown some level of infidelity to her husband by secluding herself with this man. So the fact of the matter is that that can't be what the Mishnah means. Ela dekani la kishihi arusa, the istatra, the kamashkala kishihi nasua. The alternative would be, so then what does the Mishnah mean when it says that it applies to an arusa? What happened is that the husband did kinoi, he admonished her when she, only after erusin, don't seclude yourself with Ploni. She then secludes herself with Ploni, and only after they actually get married does he go and take her to the Kohen. Strange, but that's what he does, right? Even though he knows that she's got this thing for this other guy, he still marries her, does nisuin, and then he takes her to the Kohen to make sure that she hasn't committed adultery. But the Gemara says in that situation that also the protocol would also not work, because mi bat kila maya, then the water won't work, because v'hatanya v'nikaha ish me'avon bizman sheha ish menuka me'avon amayin bod kenes ishto ein ha ish menuka me'avon ein amayin bod kenes ishto. There's a halacha that's very clear that the only time that the water works is if the man is free from sin vis-a-vis his relationship with his wife. But if he's committed an infidelity, then the water won't work. What do we mean by that? What we mean is that there's a halacha. Once a man knows that his wife has secluded herself with the man he told her not to, he's not allowed to live with her as husband and wife until he takes her to the Kohen. So how could it be that the kinoi and the stira was done before they had nisuin, and then they have nisuin, so he consummates the marriage, and then he takes her to the Kohen? He's not allowed to consummate the marriage once he knows that she secluded herself with Ploni. So, and if that were the case that he did anyway, then the water wouldn't work. So how can the Mishnah be talking about that case? So Ella dekani la kishihi arusa v'istatra v'nichnasa l'chuppah v'lo nivala. So the only alternative is, when the Mishnah talks about it working on an arusa, means like this. He did kinu yustira when she was an arusa. He admonished her, she secluded herself as an arusa, and then he brought her to the chuppah. And they had nisuin, but there was no physical consummation. Then he brings her to the Kohen. So he has not violated the halacha, he hasn't been intimate with her, and yet they've had nisuin, so she's now a nisua, and he can bring her to the Kohen. What do you see from here? So Rav Shesha says, "Ushma mino yesh chuppah la pasulos." You see that for the purposes of rendering a woman pasul as a nesua, as already a fully married woman who's consummated with her husband, chuppah is sufficient. You don't need a physical consummation in order for her to be considered a fully married woman. And similarly, Rav is justified in saying that as long as you present a woman with nisuin, with chuppah, she's now pasul for the kahuna. She's pasul for eating truma if the person that she has the chuppah with is a pasul person to her. So Amar Rava v'tispera dahamatratztahi. So Rava says, you really think you've been such a chacham? You've explained this Mishnah correctly? You haven't. because v'haki asa Rabbi Acha bar Chanina midroma asa v'aisi masnisa biyade. We have the following brisa that was brought by Rabbi Acha from the south of Eretz Yisrael. He brings a brisa with him which states very clearly as follows: Mibal adei isheich. The Torah uses the words that if you have strayed with a man other than your husband. What do the words "other than your husband" indicate? Say the brisa. Mi shekad mashchivas bal boil, below shekad mashchivas boil bal. That the only time that the sota waters will be effective is if she was physically intimate with her husband before her physical intimacy with her adulterer. But if her physical intimacy with the adulterer preceded her physical intimacy with her husband, because the husband hasn't consummated with her, so then the sota water won't work. How can you therefore suggest that the Mishnah is talking about a case where she secluded herself with her adulterer before the nisuin, and then she had nisuin with her husband, but there was no physical consummation? How's he going to bring her to the Kohen at that case, in that situation? The water won't work. Because you see from this brisa that she has to be intimate with her husband before her adulterer in order for the sota waters to work. So you haven't really explained the Mishnah correctly.
Does the sota water works only if there is in the more standard case? It doesn't just work to confirm what the witnesses saw, that there was seclusion. It works to confirm that they had relations.
It works. It's right. It's to confirm. The fact that she was secluded herself with this man doesn't mean that she was intimate with him.
Right.
It just means that she did something that was against her husband's wishes.
Right, and the witnesses saw it, and now the Kohen...
And now the purpose of the sota water is to confirm that it was an act of a physical adultery. Right? So the Gemara says, all right, we'll have to explain it this way. Amarami bar Chama mishkachas lakagon shaba aleha arusa beves aviha. So the answer would be is like this. Rav Sheshis is justified. The Mishnah is correct that they only had chuppah. What about the physical intimacy issue? Guess what? He gave her erusin. He betrothed her. She went back to her father's house. One night he snuck back to her father's house in the middle of the night and committed an act of znus. In other words, this was purely an act of lust that he had with her that was not for the sake of nisuin, right? And therefore he was physically intimate with her. Then he suspects her of committing adultery, so that he says kinoi, and then she has stira, and then he brings her to the chuppah, and then takes her to the kohen. In that situation, since he hasn't been physically intimate with her after the suspicion of adultery, after her stira, after her seclusion with the man, the sota water will work, and this is still an affirmation of the fact that chuppah makes her like a full-fledged wife. Okay, so that would be the case where the Mishnah is saying that it works for an arusa.
How would it work if he's over znus?
Well, just because he didn't act, no, he's got to be nucky in the context of their marriage and their relationship. He hasn't done an act of infidelity vis-a-vis that marriage. Znus is not considered to be an act of infidelity vis-a-vis this system, right? Okay, so the Gemara now says, but wait a minute. Let's think about that for a second. De kavase gabe shomeres yavam sheba aleha yavam beves chamiha? Question mark. So 1 second, says the Gemara. But the Mishnah also says that there are 4 cases: arusa, nesua, shomeres yavam, and kenusa. Shomeres yavam means a woman who's waiting to do yibum. So you're telling me that what the case of shomeres yavam is that he snuck in the middle of the night and he performed an act of znus with her before he did the act of yibum. And then there was kinui and stira, and then he goes ahead before and brings her to a chuppah, and then brings her to the kohen. Is that what you're suggesting took place by a woman waiting to do yibum? He says, wait a second. Shomeres yavam karis la ishto ma'al yahi. Daha amarav kana lakol. So the Gemara says, how can you say that that's a case of when she's only his arusa, or that she's a shomeres yavam? That's not a shomeres yavam anymore. We know that according to Rab, once a man commits an act of bia with his shomeres yavam, even if it wasn't for the sake of marriage, it was just an act of znus ba'alma, it was a lewd act, nevertheless she's his wife. Remember, that's what the Mishnah had said, that no matter whether your intention is for the mitzvah of Yibum or not, physical intimacy with the Yavam makes her your full-fledged wife. So how could the Mishnah call her a Shomeres Yavam after he's been physically intimate with her? She's his wife. Don't call her a Shomeres Yavam anymore. So the Gemara says, Kishmuel da'amar lo kana elu lidvarim ha'amurim beparsha. So the Gemara says, no, wait a minute. Remember back on DAF Nun Vav, which you saw on Shabbos, the Gemara had said that there's a machlokas between Rav and Shmuel. That which the Mishnah had said, that when you perform a lewd act of znus to a Yevama, you're kona her completely, she becomes your wife. Rav says that she's your wife completely for all matters, for all intensive purposes. But Shmuel says, no, she's only your wife vis-a-vis two issues. That which is written in the Parsha of Yibum, that number one, you inherit the widow's estate, meaning that the dead deceased brother's estate. That's what the pasuk is talking about, and also that you'd have to give her a get. But for all other issues, like as far as the sota water working on her, then it wouldn't. You'd have to actually have a chuppah with her. So therefore, if there are other aspects in which she's still called a shomeres yavam, and that's why it calls her a shomeres yavam. So the Gemara says you can't say that because midi hu taima el l'rav ha'amar rav kana l'kol. But one second. Remember, what are we trying to prove from this Mishnah in Sota? We're trying to prove that the halacha is like Rav, that yesh chuppah la pesulos. And if Rav Sheshis is trying to prove that Rav is correct, how can you tell me he'd only be able to prove it if you go like Shmuel? In opposition to Rav, he's got to be consistent in Rav Shita in order for this Mishnah to be a proof to Rav. So therefore, if according to Rav, once you do an act of znus to a Yevama, she's no longer a Shomeres Yavam, how can the Mishnah call her a Shomeres Yavam in the way that you just illustrated the case? So the Gemara says, Hacha b'mayaskinan kagon da'avad b'maimer. So I'll have to give you another explanation. The reason why she's called a Shomeres Yavam is because not that you did an act of znus with her, but rather you presented her with a mimer. The Yavam presents her with a mimer, and ubei shamahi darmi mimer kona kinyan gomer, and it goes according to Beis Shammai, who says that once you present a Yevama with a mimer, she becomes 100% your wife midioraisa, and you've removed her status of being a shomeres Yavam, and now she has the status of being like an arusa, who requires now nisuin. And the Gemara says, and therefore what? And therefore, we'll go according to this protocol. What you did was you gave her a mimer, and then you snuck in at night and you had an act of znus with her after you gave her a mimer, in which case, bia that is done for an act of znus does not make her your wife anymore because she's no longer under the rubric of being a Yevama. She's now under the rubric of being an Arusa. And doing an act of znus with an Arusa does not make her your full-fledged wife. It has to be for the sake of Nisuin. And then what happens is there's kinoi and stira, meaning she secludes herself with a paramour. And then you bring her to the chuppah. And in that situation, she's called a woman who is subject to the waters of the sota, and it calls her a shomeres yavam because she had this kino yustira after she got the mimer, and she was still waiting to do full-fledged yibum. So the Gemara says, "Ihachi hainu arusa." The Gemara says, "I don't understand. Why are you calling her then a shomeres yavam? You should call her an arusa because for all intensive purposes, she's exactly the same as an arusa. If you're saying we're going according to Beis Shammai and you present her with a mimer, it makes her like an arusa. So then just call her an arusa. Why do you have to give me a separate case of shomeres yavam?" So the Gemara says, "V'litai meich nesua ukenusa lavchada milsehi." But according to that argument, when the Mishnah says that you treat a nesua with the protocol of the Meisota, why then did you have to come up with a separate statement of kenusa? The word kenusa means a woman who's had yibum. But isn't a nesua and a kenusa the same thing for all intensive purposes, that she's your full-fledged wife? So ela nesua dideu kenusa dechavre hachanami arusa didei v'shomeres yavam dechavre. The answer is, says the Gemara, that from a halachic standpoint, you're absolutely right. There is no difference between the two of them. The way that we've described this process by a shomeres yavam, by presenting her with a mimer according to Beis Shammai, she becomes completely like an arusa. But in order for us to illustrate that it's possible by a woman who's a Yevama, we call her a Shomeres Yavam, even though technically, halachically, she's got the status of an Arusa, just like we do that with a by calling a woman who's had yibum, we call her a kenusa, even though she's really a nesua. But the terminology of kenusa implies that it works with a woman who's had yibum because of her previous association with a man's deceased brother. Okay, so that's not a problem. So we've successfully explained the Mishnah the way that Rav Sheshes wanted to, so that it ends up defending the psak that yesh chuppah la pesulos. Rav Papa Amar Hai Tanahu Detanya Ein Maknin la Arusa la Hashkosa Kishehi Arusa Avol Maknin la Hashkosa Kishehi Nesua. So Rashi has a little difficulty with what Rav Papa is actually saying, but he concludes by stating as follows. Rav Papa is agreeing that Rav Sheshes is bringing this Mishnah of Sota as a proof that Yesh Chuppah la Pesulos. What about your dilemma that you had? That how could you have such an argument that there was Kino Yostira when she was in Arusa, and then the man took her to the chuppah without physically consummating? How then will the Sota water work? Right, so you had to come up with this whole teretz that he did an act of znus while she was still in Arusa. He says no. That halacha, that the Sota water will only work if she was first intimate with her husband and then intimate with her paramour, is only true according to one Tana. But there's another brisa that says that it doesn't make a difference whether or not the husband was intimate with her or not, as long as he takes her to the chuppah. Then he can use the Sota water even if he never consummates with her. So therefore, this Mishnah goes according to that brisa. It's true. You showed me a brisa that came from the south of Israel that says that the only way that it'll work is if the husband was physically intimate with her before. But there's another Tana that disagrees with that. So therefore, you don't have to come up with this whole contrivance that he had znus with her when she was still in Arusa. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Amar al Yedei Gilgul. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, Rav Sheshes, I'm sorry, I totally disagree with you. This Mishnah in no way proves the principle of Yesh Chuppah la Pesulos. Your whole issue was, how can the Mishnah say that an Arusa is subject to the protocol of Mei Sota when we know that we don't take an Arusa to the Kohen for Sota? The answer is not as you suggested, that the Kino Yostira was done during Erison and the bringing to the Kohen was done after the Nisuin. The answer is quite simple. If a man and a woman have been married for 10 years and then the man suspects her of having an affair and he does Kino, he admonishes her, and then she secludes herself in front of witnesses, he brings her to the Kohen and he makes her take an oath. And the oath that he makes her take is not just swear to me that you've been faithful to me regarding this particular episode of which I suspected you, but rather he can actually incorporate other episodes also within that oath. In other words, now that I've got control of you, that you have to take an oath to me, I can also make you swear that you've always been faithful to me. That not just with this guy, but with all other previous situations throughout the course of our 10-year marriage, swear to me that you've been faithful.
Even at Erison, even going back to Erison. And that's all the Mishnah means. All the Mishnah means is that once a guy's got control of his wife to allow her to make her an oath, he can even make her take an oath about that she was faithful to him during the Erison period. That's all the Mishnah means to say. And from here we learn that Gilgul Shvua is Midioraisa. In other words, from this whole Sota Parsha, we learn that there's a principle called Gilgul Shvua, that once I got control of the situation, that I can force you to take an oath, I can also force you to swear about related issues as well, not just about this particular issue at hand. That's what's called Gilgul Shvua. I roll over into another subject, and we learn that from the laws of Sota. So therefore you have no raya from this Mishnah at all that Yesh Chuppah la Pesulos. That concludes our discussion, and now we go back to our Mishnah. Remember, our Mishnah is a machlokus between Reb Meir on the one hand, Reb Shimon and Reb Elazar on the other hand, as to whether presentation of Kiddushin between a Kohen, Gadol, and Almana, or any two people who are not allowed to be married, does it passel the woman from eating truma and going back to her father's house? So Sholach Rav Chanina Mishmei de Reb Yochanan ha'osa maimer b'yavimto v'yesh lo ach afilu hu Kohen v'hi Kohenes pasla min ha'truma. He says a related halacha, which conceptually is related. A woman falls to Yibum, and there are two surviving brothers, Shimon and Levi. Shimon presents the woman with a maimer.
Now, by presenting this woman with a mimer, he's created a situation where she's anticipating to do Yibum with Shimon, but now is precluded from having any intimacy with Levi. So vis-a-vis Levi, she is a Pesula. She's Pesula to him. So because there's a Zika between both her and Shimon and her and Levi, so that Zika, which is now sort of impeded because she's puzzled to Levi, creates a situation which is akin to a man who presents Kiddushin to a woman who is puzzled to him, and therefore that puzzle relationship that she now has with Levi precludes her from eating Truma. So now the Gemara says, Laman, who are you going like when you make that statement? Ilemela Rabbi Meir, Amar Da'amar Rabbi Meir, Mishtameres Labia Pesula Lo Achla Midioraisa. Rabbanan mi Omar. Maybe Reb Meir only holds that a kiddushin presented in the midst of a forbidden relationship is what precludes a woman from eating truma. But this is only a rabbinically forbidden relationship because a mimer only works midirabanan, right? So really she's only forbidden to Levi midirabanan. She's not forbidden to Levi midioraisa. So who's to say that Reb Meir would be so machmir that even when she has only a forbidden relationship to Levi, she's precluded from eating truma? Ve'ela Rabbi Elazar v'Reb Shimon. So the other alternative is to go to Rabbi Elazar, Reb Shimon, who are even more makel than Reb Meir. Hashta mishtameres labia pesula deoraisa achla derabanan mibaya. If they say that giving kiddushin to a woman, even though she's puzzled to you midioraisa, does not preclude her from eating truma, then surely her connection to Levi, which is only a psul midirabanan, will not preclude her from eating truma. So ela ki asa Rabin Omar asa b'maimer biyavimto divrei hakol achla. So rather Rabin says, you're right. If a man just gives a mimer, the Shimon gives a mimer to the Yevama, just because she's got a forbidden relation with Levi, that doesn't stigmatize her at all. She's still allowed to eat truma. Yesh lo ach chalal divrei hakol eina ocheles. Here's the issue. Everyone will agree that if there's a halal that's part of this family that she has Zika with, let's say Shimon's a kosher Kohen and Levi is a halal, because let's say his mother was a divorcee. So Levi is a halal. We know that there's a halacha that when a man who's a halal has a relationship with a woman, he passes her from the kahuna. So the fact that there's a zika between Levi and her, even if Shimon were to present her with a mimer, since she's still linked in some way to Levi, and she's puzzled, and that connection to Levi would theoretically puzzle her were he to consummate with her, so then that's the thing that precludes her from eating truma. Lo nechluku ela shenasan laget. The machlokus over here that would be a machlokus between Reb Meir and Reb Shimon and Reb Elazar in our Mishnah, is in a situation where the Kohen gives her a get. Now, what's the case? So Shimon gives a Yevama a get, and Rabbi Yochanan Omar Ocheles, Reish Lakish Omar Eina Ocheles. And here we could even be talking about a situation where there's only one surviving brother, Shimon. He gives her a get, and now what he's done is that he's actually precluded her from being able to do Yibum. So he now has a Zika with her, but it's a Zika that is a puzzle relationship now because he's not allowed to consummate with her. So the presentation of a get creates a scenario where it's almost like there's a puzzle kiddushin here. He can't consummate with her. He's still connected to her midioraisa, and therefore now she's in that situation where she's sort of connected to a guy that she's not allowed to consummate, and that's what makes her puzzle from eating truma. So Rabbi Yochanan says, she's allowed to still eat truma, and Reish Lakish says she's not allowed to. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Ocheles afilu leReb Meir da Amar Eina Ocheles. So Rabbi Yochanan explains. Let me explain it. The reason I hold she's allowed to eat truma is true even according to Reb Meir. When you present a woman with kiddushin in a puzzle relationship that she's not allowed to eat truma, here Reb Meir would agree that she could eat, because honey meat li mishtameres will be absula deoraisa. Because in the case of the Mishnah, she's a lady in waiting to consummate a forbidden relationship from the Torah. Here, this woman is only forbidden to him midirabanan because he gave her a get. A get only works midirabanan to preclude her, and therefore it doesn't preclude her from truma because it's only a rabbinically forbidden relationship. V'reish Lakish Amar Eina Ocheles afilu l'Reb Elazar Reb Shimon da Amri Ocheles. And Reish Lakish goes the other direction. He says, no, I hold that this woman is not allowed to eat truma, even according to Rabbi Elazar and Reb Shimon, who say in our Mishnah that a presentation of Kiddushin does not stigmatize a woman. But here we hold that the presentation of a get does stigmatize her. Why? Because Hani Mili Diyesh Lo Lahachil B'Makam Acher. Aval Hacha Keven De'en Lo Lahachil B'Makam Acher Lo. He says, I'll tell you the difference. When a man presents a woman with Kiddushin and she's puzzled to him, the reason why Reb Shimon and Rabbi Elazar hold that she's still allowed to eat truma is because the act of Kiddushin that he's given to her only is puzzle vis-a-vis her. But it's not puzzle vis-a-vis if he were to give the Kiddushin to another woman who's kosher to him. And therefore the act itself of Kiddushin is not as stigmatizing of an act as the act of consummation, right? It's not a stigmatizing act because since it could be done in theory in a kosher fashion, when it's done with her in a puzzle fashion, it does not preclude her from eating truma. But a get, when you give a woman a get, how can you tell me that you're doing an act which could be done in theory to another woman in a non-stigmatizing fashion? Anytime you give a woman a get, you render her puzzle to you. And therefore, by definition, it's a universal act of stigmatization, of puzzling a woman, and therefore it's more severe than for the presentation of Kiddushin. But so the Gemara says, but wait a minute. But maybe you'll tell me no. That when, in a normal case of a man divorcing a woman, he doesn't stigmatize her. She gets to go back to her father's house and eat truma. So what do you mean by saying that a get is a universally stigmatizing act? The Gemara explains, Choseres paskamine ukrov lebeinasha, avalha agida be. No, what we mean to say is that in a case where a man normally divorces his wife, the get completely severs his relationship with her, and that's the reason why she's allowed to go back to her father's house, because she's completely removed from him. But there's no such thing as a get which maintains a relationship with the man and still doesn't stigmatize her. And since over here, by giving her a get, she's still in some way related to him, she's still in some way connected to him through this zika, and yet she's stigmatized in becoming puzzled to him, and it's a universal kind of stigmatization because there's no such thing as a get which maintains the relationship and still will allow her to eat truma. On that basis, Rabbi Elazar and Reb Shimon would agree, says Reish Lakish, that here she's not allowed to eat truma. It's a very abstract concept, and therefore we're going to let your minds take a rest, and we'll hold it here for today. Have a wonderful